So, okay. So we're through the problem statements, and so now we're just going to get into the discussion areas. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're actually kind of on time. So that's pretty amazing. So, so we're going to go through a series of discussion areas today, and hopefully we can have everybody participate. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to come up with some common terminology. And if you responded to the test stack survey that I sent out a couple weeks ago, you know that I sent a glossary with that, and a couple of people had some, okay, well, here's a term we use that no one else seems to be using, or we're using differently. And then we have this diagram. Oh, well, I don't know what happened.
The keyboard. Nope.
Well, okay. But we're gonna get to the diagram. Actually, as we go through the glossary, it'll probably help to have the diagram. And then we're going to start talking about different areas of the stack and get ideas for, why people have done things the way they have, and what benefits and drawbacks there are to different approaches. If we can get through all of this, it'll be a miracle. But what we have on the kind of the agenda for today is not everything. So we're going to start with the glossary. Okay, so let's see. That's the diagram. Yes.
Before we get to that, can I talk a little bit about problem statements?
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I should have stopped there and let.
Right, because I think there is actually a problem statement you didn't put up there as well, and that's of modularization of the whole test frameworks. Because everybody has their test framework and their particular areas of functionality in there. And I'm sort of looking at this more from an integration perspective. The Yocto project takes a whole load of different things. So we run the LTP tests, we run other kinds of tests. We've been trying to integrate with Lava. But the problem is that everybody kind of has these things all as one sort of thing. So you either take most of Lava or you don't take any of it at all. And Fuego's probably similar. I haven't looked at it in as detail.
I have later in my presentation, I have the word monolithic a couple times.
Right, yeah. But I think this is a much bigger problem than people realize.
Oh, it's a huge, and I totally agree with you. And it's getting worse because the solution for installation, a lot of installation problems that almost all of the projects have taken is to go to containers, right? And so now it's not, you got this thing that comes from docker.io that is like really monolithic. It's monolithic and sealed with a ribbon. Well, not that ribbon, but.
And it actually makes it incompatible with the Yocto project because we have a philosophy of being able to run on different distro bases, and then it makes it hard to install because somebody says, well, you need this container to run Lava and you need this container to do something else, and it becomes a mess. So one thing the Yocto project doesn't have is a good results analysis and sort of storage and that side of things. But somebody says, well, you should be using Lava. You can't really extract that component and use it. Probably the same for Fuego and any other system. So that's a problem statement that I put there and something I think we need to think about because that would certainly help me. And I think if we could standardize even just some of these components, it would help.
No, I couldn't agree more.
And it makes me wonder if we shouldn't have some libraries out there that are standard that are, doing part of that modularity, right? Because if we could all share that functionality, or reuse it,
or an interchange format, some way of actually just storing this result in a standardized way, which allowed us to interchange between systems.
Yeah. With regard to the library would be great, but I think we have at least 7 languages represented in the room, and possibly more. Although, maybe in the case where someone's using something weird, we could say maybe, well, that's your problem if we get a lot of people are using Python. It seems to be, if I was to take, well, who's using Python for a lot of their stuff? Oh, okay. So who's using something else? Well, okay. And the something, so what is the something else? What are you using?
Bash scripts.
Bash scripts? Okay, well, so Fuego is an equal opportunity. We use Bash scripts and Python. But so what are some of the other ones? I know
Go.
you're in Go.
Same Golang.
Golang.
We use Parallel mostly.
I'm so, Perl. Oh, okay. Yeah. Ruby.
Well, actually, we took a slightly different approach.
Oh, yeah.
So back in 2009, inside TI, we were in the same problem we are right now in the community. We have the same problem inside TI with, I don't know, 10 or 12 or different frameworks. And we tried to solve that problem at the time. And the solution that we came up with is to put an abstraction on top of the frameworks, the different test framework, because some people are testing Linux, other people are testing low-level hardware, other people are testing other, totally different products, right? So it's kind of difficult it was kind of difficult to find a tool that solved all the problems. And instead, what we decided was, okay, what's common about everybody that is testing? And we tried to standardize on what is common, which at the end of the day was, a way to define your test cases. We call the test management system, and then define an API that you can replace any test management system, but you have a defined API that to communicate down and up to the test management system, right? The second layer was what we call the test master controller. You can think in terms of Lava, like Lava Dispatcher or Lava Server. But it's essentially an entity that knows about all the resources that are available. It gets test requests, and then it does the allocation, right?
Okay.
And then you define also APIs to that layer. And in the bottom layer, what we call the execution engines layer, is where you have the actual, what we call test frameworks here, or you can Fuego, Lava, or BATF, whatever.
Okay.
And for the framework itself, we use Java.
Okay.
But you can do whatever you want on the actual.
Right. Okay, so I think some of that stuff we're going to get into later, kind of, and because we're going to talk about the test definition, which I think corresponds to the top layer that you were talking about, and we'll talk about the build artifact and the run artifact, and we hope to cover the test execution API, which is E on this diagram here. And I think that might cover some of what you're talking about. So hopefully we can get back and get some more details on how you guys are doing that, and how it relates. But thank you. And then, okay, so where were we? We were talking about languages. Okay, based on the modularization. So there was the idea of a library, and then there was an idea after that. What was the other idea?
Talking about the languages we're using. So we are using, for example, a lot of Groovy code that is directly used in Jenkins, this Jenkins lib stuff. And we use it for parsing the test description and creating jobs dynamically out of that directly in Jenkins.
Do you guys have Java in other parts of your system, or?
No.
You're using Groovy without Java?
Yeah, it interacts with Jenkins, and Jenkins is written in Java.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, so if you're using Jenkins, you got Java in there. So
I think the other idea that Richard had brought up was the output format, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the results.
Interchange.
Interchange. Yeah. But one of the things, so we all know about, the TAP format or JUnit format, right? Those already exist,
right,
et cetera. I won't beat it to death.
We use it actually, and that's great. So we just started with inserting all our test results in a database, and then we just reworked it and each test just creates a JUnit file, and after we run all the tests, we just parse those JUnit files and put it into the database we would like to have. Well, and that's great because we can just use existing tools also for creating static websites and stuff like that.
Well, and so we have a whole section this afternoon. Hopefully we're going to talk about output formats. So hopefully we can get back to some more details there as well. But when you get to the point where you're coalescing results from multiple disparate tests, you have to have some commonality if you're going to operate on them the same way. And so it kind of just drops out naturally. The issue is, well, can we just agree on, they don't have to be the same formats, but like I'm hoping we can actually go through some fields today and say, well, is there something we're missing? We've adopted what we think is the kernel CA format. We have something called run.json, and we have a set of metadata that we're saving per job, but
yeah, so I mean, the results output is one part of this, but there is a second part. I mean, Yocto project specifically struggles because we don't want to start running device under test or board farms or that side of things. We at some point, we come to a point we want to test something. We don't care how, we just want to be able to do it.
Right.
And the systems, then we want the results back, and then we want our choice of where we go and put those results. But we can't pick those modules up and use them as modules today, because you either take complete system or otherwise.
Right.
So results parsing, or results formats, say, would solve one part of that, but it's a bigger problem.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
right.
And
Well,
yeah.
notice the number of letters we have on the screen for.
I get it.
And there's at least two that are not here that I thought of after Kevin and I built this diagram. So there's a lot of different interfaces. And oh, is it? Oh, there we go. Oh, that's much brighter.
So that diagram is also on the wiki, because I know not everybody can read all the thing, but all the arrows have letters, and so we'll be referring to those arrows for APIs and stuff. But so you can. Pull that
I
up
was
yourself.
joking with Kevin that in 20 years someone will be talking about interface E. just because in a 15-minute session one day we picked that letter.
Anyway, on Monday I was talking to Tim. Yesterday I was talking to Vinod Kaul. I think that we should focus before the glossary because we know we want to improve Linux, right? And we are on the Embedded Linux conference. And I think that before we start to beat to the death on the output format or whatever, I think we should focus on the test itself. It means that's the point, right? We are here to improve something, and that something is probably Linux kernel, and there could be standalone in a lot of cases, and so on. And Tim has that on the second slide, if I remember correctly. That we should focus on the test first. It means when we have something, how to run the test, what the tests are, right? It doesn't matter what language you use. It doesn't matter what test framework you have, how it's working. We should focus first on what tests to run. And yesterday I was talking to Vinod. He's happy to share his tests, what he's running on his DMA framework. I expect we have a Gert here. He has his own tests for Renaissance SoC. We have Mark here. Right? Mark is probably running also a lot of sound tests or SPI tests. It means that's probably the first thing that I would like to look before glossary and terms and so. It means how the test and where to store the test, how to share. And this is really about the sharing, right? How to share what to test. And doesn't matter if this is Python, shell script, Ruby, whatever. But if we can have an agreement, what should be the location, common location for sharing, for saving a test. It can be a log, right? It can be a shell script, it can be a pointer to whatever. But what I would like to have, and this is with my SoC vendor hat and also maintainer hat, a location where I can look, and there will be written, okay, if I want to run tests on, for example, USBs, that this is what I should run, or these are the list of devices I need to buy just to make sure, and these problematic devices, as you mentioned, they have in Sony, that this is what I need to buy just to cover the USB testing. And this is across all the SoCs, across all the architectures. And this will be wonderful if you have any agreement for that. Right. It means just simply say, okay, I personally prefer just to say, okay, let's just put it in the text format or HTML format somewhere on the wiki, right? This is something what people can edit, can add a comment to. But simply, we really, if we want to run something and improve something, we need the test cases. And it doesn't matter what testing system we are running at.
Right.
Right.
So we're going to talk about test definition, and then also later we're going to talk about shared repositories, places, hopefully a discussion about how we can come up with a way to a location, like you're saying, for sharing this stuff. Okay, I do want to go through the glossary just to make sure that we have a common understanding of some terms. But I don't want to. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time. In fact, On the automated test summit, there's a page. If someone could look at that page and tell me how much time I've allotted for this. It's not a lot of time, but I just want to make sure we don't get off track because I don't want to get into bike shedding on terminology. That's until 10:40. That's for the diagram and the glossary, right? So just about a half hour. So we don't have time to, like, if someone has, if it turns out that the glossary has some major problem or we disagree vehemently, we don't have time to fix that today. We'll just have to note it and move on. So this is how I'm going to do this. Everybody look at these terms. And on that link on the page, if you actually go to the test stack survey that I sent out or go to the test stack survey on elinux.org, they're the definitions. There wasn't enough room to put all the definitions. So is everyone thinking the same thing when I say results query? Is it, probably not, right? I'm going to go through these really, really quick. Bisection. I think most of us understand what bisection means. And it doesn't necessarily mean the exact way that Git does bisection. It just means that, bifurcating a variant space and testing to narrow down what the problem is. I think we all understand what boot is. Build artifact, okay? That's the results that have come out after you've built. And that can be a build artifact of the software under test or the program, or the test program itself, right? So Fuego builds the test program, and so does Yocto. And so the build manager, that's the thing that builds stuff.
Back to the boot?
Okay, back to the boot. Yeah. Okay. Darn, I thought I was going so fast.
Yeah. Where is that that you consider that the board booted? Where you get the shell or somewhere before that?
Boot is when power is applied to the board.
Okay.
Now I know that and it's power on. Well, maybe. Well, okay. So, no, this is why we're here, right? Is to clarify it. So.
And to clarify, we're talking about Linux booting, right?
Well, I know that if you're doing U-boot testing, right? You don't care about Linux. Boot means for you getting to the U-boot shell or whatever they call that thing. I don't know the prompt.
We can say until we can drive some test.
Until you can drive some test. Yeah, I think that's a fair definition. But
for us, booting is an essential task because kernel developers often come up with broken kernels.
Yes. So this is an epiphany I had about a couple of months ago that kernel CI, the test program for kernel CI is the compiler, right? And well, no. Actually, the test program is a combination. It's the compiler for the build portion of the test, and it's the kernel for the boot portion of the test. So, and it's the actual kernel. It's like, well, if the kernel falls over, that is the software under test. That's the thing that's...
from kernel CI perspective, a boot is a shell in a RAM disk. So like the
earliest... For Fuego, it's when we can execute...
the earliest moment you can start executing some shell commands, basically.
Right.
But
so,
as he said, the kernel also does not boot a large percentage of the time. So a boot failure is an important event as well.
That's one of the hugest disconnects between kernel CI and Fuego, right? Fuego, it's like, what? The kernel didn't boot? I mean, so Fuego has a mentality of this is late product stage testing, and it's like if you're getting kernel panics, like, oh man, you should then send the whole thing back to. And so we don't concern ourselves very much with provisioning or with boot issues. We concern ourselves so yeah.
So will you usually consider the boot as a kind of test? Since in 0 day we do a lot of boot testing within the VM. Yes, I want to say, so here the boot is the process to put up the board, or you treat it as a kind of testing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what is the definition that I have written down for boot? Do we need to change it?
The DOT from an off state.
That works for me. So is there something? Well, what do we want to kind of clarify that as? Do we want to say that it is? That means we've gotten to a state where something is. Well, when boot is the test, it's a different thing, right? You're actually looking at maybe the kernel log messages, and that's your log.
No, then the kernel is the test.
The kernel is the test.
We got to the bootloader, we passed the bootloader, so that's our, I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, the kernel boot is just the first test.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's the first
That's
test.
the way kernel CI looks at it. It's just the first test. If that fails, you don't get to run any other tests. But
Right.
I mean, it depends on what you're. I think it depends on what the software under test is, right? So if the
Right.
software under test is something that's interactive, then to me, boot is when I first get to a prompt where I can do something, which is why I sort of liked his definition of boot is when you've gotten to the point where you can start running tests. But I agree that there are cases where that is not what you're after, right? Where you're not to something interactive yet.
Well, before that we had the bootloader. Yeah. So.
But to me,
Yeah.
to me, the
Okay.
bootloader is also interactive, right?
Okay.
So EFI.
So since we're just on the B's, I'm gonna take a mental note, and then we're gonna move on. Okay, so dependency, I have a whole page on that, so we'll come back to that one. Deploy, I know different systems use this differently. In Fuego, for us, deploy was the test program. So that's how we use the word, although we could probably switch our terminology. I think most people, when they say deploy, they mean, well, okay, so in Fuego, we said provisioning was when you install the software under test, and deploy is when you install the test program. But a lot of systems don't have the notion of putting the test program on the system. It's just already there, right? And so we can adjust our terminology if we want to. But
Tim, you mentioned provisioning a few times. I'm not that familiar with the word, and it's not on the glossary, unless it's the
it's
pass
not.
criteria provision.
Well, that's right.
verb.
It's not on the glossary. So, it is on the diagram, though. Oh, yeah.
It's on your glossary on the.
Is it on? Is it in? Did it? How did it?
On the wiki.
Oh, there it is. It
So
should
it's
be
that
down
one.
here. It's missing a return.
So it's two separate bullets.
Yeah, two separate. So provision. Well, so Kevin and I kind of talking about the difference between deploy and provision. Kevin and I kind of came up with the notion, and again, we're just kind of making this up on the fly, right? So, so if this becomes an industry standard, we'll be like really proud. You can put a statue of us somewhere. But provision to deploy means to install the software under test very specifically, and in most cases, if the software under test is the kernel, that means the kernel installation. Okay, provision. And that's different than how Fuego does it. So the people in the room for Fuego will have to wrap our head around that. But provision is setting up the more general test environment. That means setting up the hardware. Like if you're doing power monitoring on a kernel, and so if your test is of power utilization for something, that means provisioning means setting up the power monitoring hardware and the entire test environment for the test. And you know, in the case of like USB testing, it might be controlling that hardware to mux the USBs into the right position so you can do on-the-go testing versus host client testing. So provisioning means kind of the bigger environment. That's our thinking.
well, we kind of put hardware here as well.
Yeah, provision hardware.
Making sure you have all the hardware necessary and available at that particular moment to actually.
So provisioning for a network test could be making sure that your network server is running, like netperf is running on the host side.
In a couple of years,
That is test case specific provisioning.
But that's very test case specific.
But deploy is like in our terminology, we do like.
Oh, wait a second.
We do like loading the images into the target. That can be JTAG or SD or QSPI or any other boot mode.
Right.
So where you will deploy all the images into the target and it is ready for the test execution.
Right.
It's
So I
just
think-
like build, deploy, and execution.
Yeah, so I think your definition to deploy matches the one that we're thinking of. Okay, is there any Does anyone else have terms for those operations? So ignore the terms, but okay, there's two different operations, right? There's setting up the software under test. It's getting that installed on the board. And then there's an operation which is setting up the bigger environment. Now we have a third operation in Fuego, which is install the test software, right? So we do not assume that the test software is already on the board. And we've been calling that deploy. So we'll just have to kind of deal with the fact that our terminology is a little bit different there. And I don't know if Jenkins even has a term for deploy, because their terminology is like, wow, Jenkins terminology blew my mind. Well, they call everything a build, and it's like, well, where's the test? It's like, well, no, it's a build. It's like, what? Okay. Okay, device under test. Does everyone agree on that one? Do we?
Does this include virtual machines?
Yes. Yes. Well, just it's a term of art of the industry. So, yes, a virtual machine can be a device under test.
The same way like a set of devices under test before setting.
Well, and we'll come to that in a sec. Yeah.
Does it include multiple devices when you have to test a distributed system?
Clarify. What are you talking about? Are you talking? Okay, there's another concept on the next page, which is I'll go to the next page. A device type, which is the name of a set of devices under test that you pick from. I don't like that one. I think that's what Lava uses.
Comes from Lava.
But I like pool, because pool to me is kind of more familiar. But I can live with another term if that's what everybody else is using. Are you talking about something? Are you talking about this where? Okay, so let me.
I think like multi-node,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
for example,
So are you talking about where you have multiple pieces of hardware involved in the same test?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if we have the term that is not on here. And looking at the diagram, are you talking about this stuff? External equipment?
Yeah, it would be like system under test or something like that.
I don't know if we have. I'm not sure. Either I'm not understanding or I don't think we have it. Are you talking about when there are 3 or 4 machines?
Yeah.
Doing what? How are the machines related? Is only one of them under test, or are you actually testing like a distributed system?
Yeah, for example, you are testing a network performance and you need 2 machines for testing it.
Well, so
Those are devices under test. I think.
yeah, there's devices under test. I know that Lava has.
Devices or devices.
Well, it depends on. So I would say this. So if you're running netperf, and the purpose of running netperf is to see if a device has a particular performance, then I would say that the netperf client is on your device under test, and your netperf host or server is on a piece of other test equipment. Now it could be the host, some other thing.
Reference.
It's a fixed reference, or like there are some tests, in fact, in Fuego that go out and see if they can ping Google as part of network testing, right? And so Google is a fixed reference point. I don't know if that's an abuse of Google services, but yeah, go ahead. But so in that way, I would characterize that type of test as just being a single device under test with external test equipment. But if you're talking about a different thing where you could be looking at a system as a whole that consists of multiple, that would just be multiple devices under test, and not a DUT pool. A DUT pool is for scheduling purposes when you have the same type of device, and any one of them can handle a. Oh, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, but basically we have tests where we have distributed software running on multiple identical devices under test.
Right.
And that's a single test case.
Yeah, and that's. So did I answer your question, or I'm not sure I did. Okay. Oh, we'll get back to you.
So for us, device is never under test. It's more of a dependency, like resource required to test the software under test. So like, yes, but it's not under test.
Okay. I guess I don't understand.
Well, we're testing the software. The device is not under test.
Oh,
it's
okay.
just like a requirement, a resource that is
okay.
needed to test the software.
Oh, I got to write that down because that's blowing my mind.
The combination of the VM with that software makes your device under test.
It's like a
software you want to test. That's your device under test.
I think this means just the device.
No, I mean, it's a generic term in the industry, but it doesn't mean just the hardware, it also means the hardware with the software that you're running on it and where you want to run the test.
Yeah, can someone read the definition? Because I actually think it says what you just said. Someone have that on the...
So is there a term for device without the test software?
No.
Board or device?
Well, board. Sometimes people say a board.
Yeah, but target might be better because also board doesn't handle
Well, yeah,
VMs,
target
right?
doesn't handle... and I know that, like, for virtual machines, right? So that is an interesting view. So I think the definition that I have there says it's the device under test, including the software under test.
Yeah, so in your case, it's VM plus application that you're testing, I guess.
No, with just the application. We're not testing it.
Well, but it runs on the VM. So the VM running the application is a device under test. And your tests interact with the application.
For instance, if
No,
there is
but under test means that that's something that is under test, that's something that we are testing and want to find bugs there.
Yeah, you're testing the application.
Yes.
And you need just a VM to run the application.
Yes.
Right,
While
right,
in most other cases here, it's about testing drivers running on the device.
Well, I
something
mean, when
like
we're
that.
testing
Not
the
always,
kernel,
but
right,
the
we're testing
kernel.
the kernel, but you can't test the kernel absent something that's running it, right?
Requires like the test software, you can test kernel without the tests, but the
Right.
tests are not under test. That's
Right.
just-
Okay. Well, I'm going to make a note of that one also, and maybe we need to put some clarifying language in there if you're testing a piece of software, well, I don't know. I'll have to think about that and maybe take that offline. So there's a comment in the back. Can we? What? Oh yeah. Sorry. Just a sec. We had another person.
Yeah, okay, so actually my question is very similar. So if the test purpose is for the kernel, we just leverage the VM to do the testing. So here the VM or the actual host, that doesn't matter. So in under this situation, will you still call it a device under test, or you just call it like a test box or a test device?
Yeah, just a test target. So do people use the terminology target? I mean, how many people have used the word target in their docs or their? Okay, I had to do a big switch over because I used target for years and years.
You don't have a dog, right?
What? Well, yeah. How many people, if they had a doc, would use the word target? No.
So sorry to interrupt. So the test target is different than the DOT, right? Because my understanding is for the DOT this is part of my test purpose, and I want to do some validation for the device itself. But sometimes my only goal is for the release kernel, so the device may not matter. Under this situation,
Right.
we will still call it a DOT.
So I think that's the same point. I think
right.
that you're
Yes,
not
similar.
actually testing that piece of hardware, right?
What if we call it just board or target instead of the
Well,
device?
mainly because this is a term of art. I mean, because this is and maybe it's not the right term of art.
It's a term of art in embedded, but we're not talking about just embedded.
Well, maybe that's the issue. It's,
Just a second.
I think if you just use system under test,
system under test.
that's
Well, that makes SUT, which is software under test.
sorry. Well, there is that problem. It collides with but I mean, system is not hardware. It puts the idea in your head that it's not just the hardware. And yeah, I mean, for me, not coming from embedded, device does make me think of boards in someone's cupboard. But yeah, I guess we need a new acronym.
Well, no, this is the reason we're having this meeting, right? Is to kind of get other people's perspective on the same problem, right? And so if device under test is not a term of art for enterprise testing or the other things people are doing, that's
basically I came from the enterprise background and servers, big servers and stuff. And for me, most of the terms you are using are completely alien. So
okay.
it took the survey took me all the day, but not because the question was too complicated. It took me all the day to understand what you are asking for, basically. So
well, I appreciate that input actually. So, I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to bridge the alienness between different camps, right?
But once I realized what we are asking for, I realized that we are solving the same problems, basically.
Right.
So
that's why we're talking about
yeah, basically, yes.
No, thank you for saying that.
We can't even argue if we're not using the same terms. Right? So that's the point.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to have to come back to device under test and maybe discuss that more, and maybe we can come up with something that more people recognize or are familiar with. Okay, well then these next two should be great. The DUT controller, that's the thing that controls the board, and the DUT scheduler, that's the thing that schedules the board.
But that's both software in your mind.
No, the DUT control. I don't know. I have taken. So yeah. So what is a DUT controller? Is a PDU a DUT controller, a power display unit, or power distribution unit?
Just to go back to this point about testing software in a VM, I know that the terminologies are embedded, but I guess you could call a device under test VM. I know I'm cringing, but the DUT controller is the kind of libvirt or whatever controls the VM. The DUT scheduler, they're the same. I think the concepts are correct. It's just the names are a bit confusing. But ultimately, you still need to start that VM, to put software on that VM, to run a test. And I think these concepts still apply, but the names are still oriented to physical hardware.
So my main comment was about the under test part.
Right.
If we call it just device, I can
Right.
make that to virtual machine, but like, is the under test part actually important here?
Well,
It's really common in compliance.
yeah. So I think your point is valid, right? So in some cases, we're not testing the hardware, right? We're not testing the device. We're testing the software that's running on it.
Because software is running on the hardware, right?
Right.
Every test, even testing a hardware, it doesn't matter if this is running, right?
Well,
You're running application and still testing the hardware.
Right.
Right, because it has to run somewhere.
When you run Hello World, you're actually executing a lot of instructions and a lot of microcode.
And we are there. It means we are testing hardware, even if you are running application running on the VM. It's
Right.
still a hardware test, right? Sort of.
Well, yeah, but I don't think that's what we're.
But we are testing interaction.
Very few people test like the VHL for an Intel chip using Hello World.
Yeah, you know, I don't know Intel, but still there is a communication. There could be a communication with the lowest layer, with the firmware, which has an interaction with the hardware. Right. You simply don't know. It depends on the application. It means it is still a test of hardware.
Okay.
With DUT controller, you not only mean power control, I guess, but also emulating key presses, SD muxing, USB
jumpers,
host, terminal,
topology
changing, whatever.
So the power control, you'd think that would be like the easiest thing to consolidate on, but there's like a bazillion different ways. Well, not a bazillion, maybe 5. But there's lots of different ways that power is controlled, even though it's just basically it's a binary thing. It's 1 bit, right? On, off. Well, it's not even that simple, right? But then you get into like bus, being able to toggle buses, right? So turning USB on and off. And that turns out to be complicated because there are multiple pins and signals involved, and things like HDMI where you have to, I think Powell was talking yesterday or the other day in a talk about the EDID thing you have to send down to make sure the resolution is correct on the board. It's like, oh my gosh. You think it's something like just turning HDMI on and off. It turns out to be much more complicated than you think. But the answer to your question, that was the long-winded answer to saying yes. It's we're talking about more than just the power control. It's all the other control bits. And I don't know if, so DUT control is, usually you think about, if we could just get, well, actually we have a whole section where we're going to talk about that later today, so we'll move on. Okay, we got 10 minutes and we haven't gotten to the diagram yet. Okay, the lab. That's just a group of resources for running tests on multiple things. Okay. A log, do we agree what a log is? Output from the test program or output from the system, right? Because we look at system logs, log parsing, that's when we go through the log and take it from whatever human readable or machine readable format it was in and put it into some other format that we like better. A monitor is when you are watching some other attribute of the system. So like if you're running ftrace at the same time you're doing a test, or you're looking at a power module and gathering power information while a test is running. So that's something that's kind of outside of the test. It's not, but it requires separate instructions to start and stop or poll or whatever. Notification, usually for that, what we're talking about is at the end of the test, you've decided something about the test and you want to tell someone. Yes?
We learned that we need to distinguish...
Wait just a sec.
We learned that we need to distinguish between two kinds of notification. One kind of notification we send to the ones that started the test, and one that we need to alert the team that is maintaining the test infrastructures that there are errors inside the lab because the board is not booting or something like this.
Okay, so that's actually not what I was expecting you were going to say when you said there were two. Okay, so when you say, well, right, because tests fall over for a lot of reasons. Maybe this doesn't happen so much in the enterprise space, but in embedded, so many things can go wrong with your lab. It's unbelievable. And so detecting false positives, right, when it was caused by some, a short in some wire, or, the flash burned out or something, it's like, oh my gosh, what a pain. So that is actually a good distinction. I don't know if we need to change that, but it might help to clarify that there are multiple recipients. And you had two. I thought you were going to, what was the first one you said?
The one who committed the test or started the test.
Okay, so the test, well, so do you ever bypass that person and go straight to the owner of the software? Because I think that's what 0-day does, right? 0-day, a patch comes in. Well, I don't know. Are they considered the starter of the test? Is that implicit now in an email to the kernel mailing list that you started a test? I think it is. Okay. Okay, yes.
Just pointing out that Billbot have reports, and the reports have a bunch of kind of notification. Like one of the kind is like pushing to some GitHub status push, or and also that Billbot doesn't have all the deploy, that controller, that scheduler. Everything is a build, and we have factory of build, and each factory have its own step. So we don't consider such things.
So, I'm sorry, what don't you consider the deploy or the?
That controller, we have a scheduler, but it's different things from that scheduler.
So are you doing build testing, or are you doing build and boot testing?
Depend which kind of script the build step, the factory step is calling. So we don't define such things.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting when I was talking to Kevin, thank you, is that for a lot of these things, as you kind of talk to other people, you realize that either they're not doing something, right, and so they don't even have a term for it, or they might be doing it and they're doing it so implicitly that they don't have a term for it either, right? So a lot of, and one of the examples is like build artifacts, right? People don't think, if they're just saving a file to a local file system, they don't view that as like an API, but it is, because there's a path and there's a format you're writing in, and but it's so implicit that you don't actually, you don't call that your build artifact repository access API. It's a file open and close. But other people break those apart really, again, that comes back to the factorization thing, right? People have this factored differently.
Sorry, so just to clarify, so here you treat the alert as part of the notification, right?
No, that's not part of notification. Well, no, I don't think of it. That is usually on this diagram. Oops. On the diagram, usually when we're talking about notifications, we're talking about way down here in post-processing. So when we do the results analysis, we send out a notification saying either your lab is broken, right, to the lab people, or your software is broken to the QA engineer. So this is outside of this. Now in your system, it might be running in here, but it's in terms of like the overall process, it's late in the process.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I made confusion, but my answer was two kind of answer.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. How are we doing on time? Not that great. Let's see. Report generation. And so I hesitate to go too fast over these because some of the ones that I thought were like super common are not as common as I thought. A result, that's pass fail, right? Everybody agree on a results query? Well, it's not, yes, you're right. It's not just pass fail. There are at least 4 other things I can think of. But it's the outcome, right? A results query is when you're using a database query or you're doing something to aggregate results or look at the results. A run, okay? This is what Jenkins refers to as a build. And that's what confused me for like 6 months. But a run is the actual, right? It's the instance of a test execution, right? And you may have, so run is a verb and a noun in English, so I had to put these qualifiers on. For some people, a run is very implicit. Like in Jenkins, the run object is only ever in memory. They don't have a persistent piece of data on disk for a run, or what they call a build. Let's see, a run artifact, that's all the junk that you get after you've done a test. Yeah?
How is this different from log?
So a run artifact, you might have, so a log is, a log is one of the run artifacts. And there can be different, so whether or not you consider the data from a monitor, a log is, most of the things that are run artifacts are logs, right? But you could have other things. I'm trying to think of an example of something that...
Like audio capture, video capture, you're capturing frames, you're capturing images, all those come along with the logs or any sort of...
Right, yeah.
You're collecting results. It could be binary along with your logs.
Yeah, so logs are usually thought of as textual, but there are other things that you could be gathering, like a trace dump or something is not, strictly speaking, a log, but it's still a run artifact. It's something that was produced during the run. Was that?
Why are we doing this distinction?
Well, because a WAV file is not a log. Because there's an MPEG is not a log. You might produce an MPEG as part of a run, and that's a run artifact, but it's not a log. So we're distinguishing between the text things. Hey, Steve. Distinguishing between the text things and other things that you might get. So
a log is just one type of run artifact.
Okay, why do we want to distinguish them?
We're not distinguishing them, we're just defining them.
So the run includes not only the logs, but also the whole environment in which that test was realized. So once you have all that information, in theory, you could repeat the same environment, the same kernel version, everything, and reproduce the same error.
Yeah, so another run artifact, I would say, is the metadata associated with the run. So for instance, if you have, like in Fuego, we have something called a spec, but it's the variant. It's the set of command line options that were passed to the test program. So we preserve those. So that's not a log. but we preserve that as part of the test metadata so that we can, theoretically, we don't have this feature now, but the reason we save it is so that we could replay the test later under the same conditions. So you can have things like environment variables, command line arguments, and you could save other stuff that's not strictly speaking a log, but is part of the. Yeah, it could also be that. It could be the status of your test lab at the time the test was run.
A good way of thinking about it might be a random number, some sort of seed in there. So you could save out that seed so that you could reproduce what happened later.
Right. Yeah. So all of that is, I mean, we could also just say run data. Artifact implies that it's persistent storage, that there's an actual object there. But so, okay. Serial console. Do we all know what the serial console is? I was hoping that would be the least. The software under test. Test agent. By this we mean something that runs on target that is helping or managing stuff on the DUT. So the most obvious one that people are familiar with is ADB in the case of Android. But there are other ones. Isn't there one for Eclipse? Eclipse has some kind of target agent for when they're TCF. Not to be confused with Intel's TCF. SSHD is actually
syslogd. I mean, the syslogd and things like that are basically tests. You could consider those.
Yeah, you could consider syslogd because it's gathering information at the same time your test is running. The test definition, we'll come back to that. The test program, that's the thing that actually runs. Okay.
Sorry, just to go back to serial console.
Oh
no! I mean, surely we're at risk of being too specific here, whereas if you have, like, I don't know, some enterprise system, you're probably going to use SSH. So perhaps it should be more generalized console.
No, but I don't mean console. I mean very specifically the serial console.
Okay, sure, fine. Yep.
So there are other ways of getting information, including the TTY0 or whatever, the console information from the kernel.
So I guess in this case a BMC would also be a serial console, right?
What?
A BMC console would also be a serial console, right?
I don't know what you're saying.
So BMC is a management chip on server systems where you can essentially get the serial console out over the network.
Yes.
So that would be a serial console in this.
If I understand you correctly, then yes.
The APMI we are using that in our testing environment.
So there are other things. So I thought this was so common that everybody used it in embedded, but people do use other things. I guess, is anyone still using NetConsole?
We are even using JTAG console.
Oh well, JTAG. Well, there's JTAG.
It
so.
can be useful in certain cases.
Yeah.
If you just drop serial,
Well, no, but I wanted. I don't mind adding console to the list, but I think serial console serial console carries along with it the notion that it is the primary output mechanism for, well, no, does it? It's not the primary, no. Yeah.
I would just say this. I don't care what it is, if it's serial or whatnot. I don't care what it is, if it's serial or whatnot. What I would love to have when I was doing embedded debugging in a past life is as long as I could write to something with just assembly. So basically write the output.
It's the output for the kernel.
Yeah, in
output
assembly
stream of the kernel.
at boot up, right in the very first thing.
Right.
Could I write an X to make sure that, hey, I got to this point in time?
Yeah.
Well, USB doesn't cut it.
Well, oh no, I know that. No, I've done debugging where the LEDs were the output mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, let's see. Test program, test scheduler. This is the thing that, in this definition, does someone have that? Can they read that definition? I can't remember exactly what I said. It's the thing that chooses which target or device under test to run the thing on.
Program for scheduling tests, selecting a DUT for a test, reserving it, releasing it.
Oh, okay.
How is it different from a DUT schedule?
That is a good, so a DUT, well, that's a good question. in my opinion, the reason I threw this on there is because, oh no.
Well, DOT scheduler that's then, for example, let's say, for example, LabGrid. The test scheduler might then be, let's say, Lava.
Right. So the difference would be, this knows about the accessibility of the DUT, but it doesn't know necessarily about the features of the test and how they match to the different DUTs. So I might say I have a BeagleBone test, and I have a test, and one of its dependencies is that it wants to run on BeagleBones, right? And the test scheduler says, okay, well, I'll go find you some BeagleBones. The DUT scheduler is something that says, well, I have 3 BeagleBones in my lab, and all 3 of them are working right now, so you can't have any of them. But in like 10 minutes after LTP is done, you can have, BeagleBone number 1. So, does that make sense?
No, I think the test scheduler is something like it selects the particular test case or test suite based on the selection and starts the control. But it's
Right.
no way that the test scheduler doesn't know about the targets or anything. It's all the test case which is going to.
Well, yeah, can you repeat that with?
Yeah, what I'm saying, like the test scheduler is even before the DUT, where it will select the particular test cases based on the inputs that user has providing, like test suite and particular test case within the test suite.
Okay.
So that level of management, not exactly like.
I'm not sure.
Like if you look at the flow diagram, you have a test scheduler. Then one of the things it's going to have to do is figure out what device. So you have a test scheduler that's going to end up invoking some sort of DUT scheduler.
Right. No. Well, a lot of like Fuego doesn't actually. So Fuego is like monolithic, like a lot of systems, and so it doesn't actually distinguish between the DUT scheduler and the test scheduler, and we don't handle DUT pools. So for us, the test indicates the board it's going to run on. But other systems are more flexible, right there.
So do you use something like ADB sharding?
I'm sorry, ADB sharding?
Sharding, yes. So like you call ADB, say, give me 5 shards of the whole test suite, and then it will go and select the devices and parts of the test, of the whole test suite to run on each device.
Yes, that would be part of test scheduling.
Yeah. From my point of view, test scheduler, imagine that randomization testing, what we do, right? It means there is something what is do the randomization, which is the test scheduler. And the device under test scheduler, it's something, I have several boards, all of them are valid, but I need to schedule which one I will use for what, right?
Right, exactly.
That should be the distinguish.
Yeah. Okay, I actually think we came to kind of agreement on that one, but maybe not. Oh, wait, go ahead.
It's not all that managed by the test agent. Like the test agent is sending which board is over test definition.
Which one? Oh, test definition?
Test agent.
Oh, test agent.
Like when a board became disponible, the test agent will send like, oh, this board can get the test.
No, I would say, well, I mean, that's something that a test agent could do. Test agent means something that's running on the board that's helping with the test. But I didn't envision with this term that it was helping with the scheduling.
Okay.
That it's more like Lava Test Shell or something, or ADB or TCF.
Okay.
You could, if you have an agent on the board, it can help you with other aspects of the test cycle.
So in Billboard we have Billboard Worker that is doing also such things, and scheduler is different part. Is but yeah.
Okay. We have now exceeded our allotted time for this but we're so close to the end that I want to finish. Okay, test software. So what's the difference between the?
Yeah, excuse me. So guys, I see that from the wiki you mentioned the data scheduler could be the same as the test scheduler. So is it still true? So that we don't need to distinguish them, right? Sometimes.
Well, no.
Some systems do not.
Some systems do not distinguish between the DUT scheduler and the test scheduler. In particular, Fuego doesn't. Okay. But other systems do. They have slightly different roles. They're both around selecting which DUT to run, but it's different criteria that are used for the selection. This is usually based on features, and this is like based on time and availability, right? So you could have, for instance, okay, let me just go through a cycle. So someone submits a test. Oh. So someone submits a test, and well, it's the same one I already gave, which is someone submits a test saying, I want to run LTP on BeagleBone, right? And so the test scheduler says, well, I got to find me a BeagleBone. The test scheduler says, do I have any BeagleBones available? Okay, which are two different operations. They're managing two different pieces of data. Or it could be, I want to test it on a USB with a PHY from a certain vendor, right? And the DUT scheduler doesn't know any of that. He just knows whether a board's in use or not.
But when the DUT scheduler actually pass the test program to the DOT, so does it still need a knowledge for the test program itself?
No, well, again, these are factored all kinds of different ways,
yeah.
But no,
Okay.
Usually not. The DUT scheduler doesn't know really anything about the test. It's pretty limited in what it's doing. Usually what happens is it just opens up, well, I'll just speak from my experience. Usually it just opens up, it's just the conduit by which the rest of the framework talks to the DUT. So.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip test software because I think it'll be too confusing, the difference between test software and test program. The transport, okay. Transport is I tried to borrow a networking term. This is how you get materials between the test framework and the device under test. So a lot of times that's SSH, but it could be other things. You can shove stuff through the serial console. You can JTAG it. But there's some way that you transfer materials. The trigger, for me, this is the thing that causes the test to execute. So sometimes it's a user clicking a button in a user interface. Sometimes it's a commit hook, right? A git hook that a commit occurred, or it could be a patch showing up on a mailing list is what triggered a test. Any disagreement or anything? Okay. A variant, I've got a whole slide on variants I'll talk about later. And then you can argue with me on that one. And then visualization is at the end, when all this stuff is done, you get pretty pictures. So that's, okay. Well, that took too long.
So Tim,
yes.
how many bike sheds can you put on one slide?
We said at the beginning we were going to try not to bike shed this, and we actually did not too bad of a job. We only exceeded our allotted time by 10 minutes. So that was pretty good. So now let's bike shed the diagram. Yeah, let's put the diagram on the bigger screen. I actually have it on here. Oh, we don't have time to talk about these candidate terms. Let's just take it to the list. What do people, except one thing. What do people call PDUs? PDUs? Is that acceptable term of art throughout the industry? Or?
It was foreign to me until I got into Lava, and then I said, okay, that's fine. To me, that was a foreign term until I got into doing Lava, and then I realized it was a very common term in network infrastructure or lab infrastructure. So
actually, the same thing to me. I used to just call this the power control module or something, but it, whatever. And then we will have to debate those later. Okay, so I'm going to skip over all this stuff. Although I did.
Do you have the diagram?
Yeah, I do. Okay, so here's the diagram. Okay, so I would argue, okay, so what happens when you run a test? Okay.
I propose that we...
Oh, should we?
I propose that we start discussing... I'm sorry. I propose that we start, and I think this goes with a comment that's I think you made earlier. I believe one of the key outcomes out of this meeting is to somehow agree on a place where we can start documenting test cases for different areas. Perhaps people can vote things that they are using or not using. But before we can get to get there, we need to agree on what a test case is. So can we start by talking about test definitions, and then before we start talking about the actual flow, because test definitions, the way you define a test will impact the way you run it. So before we discuss about, farms and schedulers and whatever, can we first talk about test definitions?
Well, test definitions is the very next thing after the diagram.
I think what we should do with this diagram is only discuss it in the sense, is there any big pieces that are completely missing from this diagram? What did we miss in the diagram?
So we'll get to test definition very soon.
For example, Billbot recently implemented the multi-master, and I see that there is only one front end, but in some cases there are many.
Okay. Well, I think, yeah, that's, I think it'd be worthwhile put multiple front ends.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
There could be multiple everything. In fact,
yeah,
these test definitions, we have multiples. These are not mistakes.
Yes, yes.
So I will, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, CLI tools to me also happens earlier than backend.
Well, that's true. Okay, we should be writing this down, so let me write.
Yeah, I guess those were meant for CLI tools specifically for the back end. I mean, they're obviously
There's CLI tools everywhere.
We're all Linux hackers, so there's CLI tools for pretty much everything.
Okay, one more thing to, this is multiple front end.
By the way, do we need to keep using this mic? There are mics around for the recording, but do we need this mic to hear each other? Or just yelling is okay, or what?
I think he's saying yes, we need the mic.
We do need the mic? Okay.
Okay.
We have another one. You guys do?
Oh, we have 3. Okay, we should get some. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna say that there are 2 things missing on this diagram, at least from Fuego's perspective. One, there's no arrows inside this. Okay, so there are definitely interfaces between the DUT control host and the individual things, which I would call the DUT control driver interface, and those are not standardized, right? They're all over the map. And so I think that we're missing an arrow in here, and we don't have a letter for it. So
That's because there's 100 arrows in there.
And then the other thing I would say that we're missing, and it could just be that it belongs either here or here, I think we need a test runner process or thing, right? So we have something that is, maybe it's part of test management, maybe this is the test runner, but you've got something that is actually invoking the test program. And that's not the scheduler, right? The scheduler is not invoking the test program. You've got something that is actually initiating the test.
I thought it was the backend, but
No, the backend is, this is like a database of results.
I think that something's missing is possibly how the thing's being started in the process, because there's an implication there that code review is triggering the build, which then triggers other things. That's not necessarily always how it happens, because the front end sort of feeds into something where you would just trigger a process. So
Right. I'm not sure that code review is perfectly here either.
Yeah.
This is actually kind of more the entire software development with most of this being the test part of it.
So just replace code review with trigger?
With trigger?
Yeah.
Replace it with trigger. I mean, we started that with code review in mind.
And we do testing before code review.
No, you do code review before testing.
It's a circle.
It's a circle.
Yeah.
It's connected all the way around. Okay, so let me jot that down though. Okay. Anything else? Anything else? So this is the thing. Raise your hand if you're not on this sheet. Or if you're not here. Okay. So we can all live with this, right? And this is just a communication mechanism. This is not a standard, but it's just to allow us to say, okay, well, when you're talking about, controlling the DUT, right? You're talking about G. When we're talking about distributing a test to a lab, we're talking about E. When we're talking about a build server's up here, and it's putting something here. Notice there's not an interface directly here. Usually this manager will attach build artifacts But there could be other, like Lava has this thing where directly from the DUT, I think you can send something to the run artifact server. So there's lines that are not represented here, but we're trying to encapsulate so many different kind of viewpoints. It's kind of hard. Okay, so that's for our nomenclature, our terminology, so we can kind of have a shared way to communicate.